So we're going to continue today and kind of reiterate and go back on number 4 of our events that were negative during the Civil Rights Movement during LBJ's term. And we're going to talk about Chicago, July of 1966. So get back into your notes there if you would. And we'll kind of review this a little bit. We told you that after the march from Selma, Dr. King began to focus the Civil Rights Movement where? From where to where? Anybody want to remember that? From south to the north. And the place he picked to continue the Civil Rights Movement was Chicago. Riots had been occurring in Chicago, as well as other black communities across the northern sections of the country. And he realized that he could not only battle poverty in the south, he also had to make an effort in the north as well. So he put Chicago on his radar, so to speak. And instead of moving into the Hilton Ritz or whatever you call a nice hotel, he decides to move his family right into the ghetto areas in a rundown apartment in Chicago. So Martin Luther King Jr. moves his family there. And we kind of explained in the Chicago slums that black people tried to live by the creed, love thy neighbor. And a Reverend Walter Fautroy, who was a member of the SCLC, explained that, and I explained it to you, of what the philosophy of love thy neighbor was in the ghettos of Chicago. He stated that people love their neighbor in self-defense. Okay? I want my neighbor to have some income, otherwise he might be coming for my income. I want my neighbor to have justice, otherwise guess who's going to face the weight of his anger. Anger leads to violence, and violence drives people mad. So his point was that he wanted his neighbors to have income, because if they didn't have income, they were going to come and get his income. You want your neighbors to have justice, because if you don't have justice, the people that they're going to take that out on aren't going to be the people that aren't giving them the justice, it's going to be the people that live next to them. So that was the philosophy of love thy neighbor. We also mentioned that in Chicago, Dr. King launched a campaign. He wanted to address the following issues: education, employment, and unfair housing practices. And we stated that in order to do this, he was going to do what? Levi, what was he going to do to protest this? To protest lack of education, lack of employment, and unfair housing practices. What was he going to do? What was he going to do to address those issues? He was going to do it in late July 1966. Anybody? He's going to organize a series of marches. Now the problem with these marches is they're going to be through all white neighborhoods. And they're going to protest discriminatory practices of real estate agents in the area. Because what are real estate agents doing? Why would they be protesting real estate agents in the area, all white neighborhoods? They don't want to sell any houses or rent any houses to black people. We're going to take some time and watch some of the old All in the Family Archie Bunker videos, and it's a perfect example. He lives in Queens, New York, and they're always worried about the Puerto Ricans or the blacks moving into the neighborhood. Okay? And in this time, what Martin Luther King was saying is that these real estate agents in Chicago are discriminating against blacks by not, even if they have the money, by not selling them housing in the all-white neighborhoods, because they were nicer neighborhoods. I can tell you a quick story here that had to do with my father. I'm not proud of this, but my father grew up, I'm 57 years old, so you can figure what era he grew up in. And we were living in Billings, Montana, and my dad took a job in Forsyth, Montana, and we had trouble selling our home in Billings, so he decided to rent it, okay? Well, the Air Force came in and said, gee, we're looking for some housing in the Billings area, and we'll make it really easy for you. Well, the Air Force will rent your home. And he thought that was great because you wouldn't have to worry about getting paid, nobody would rip you off. Because the Air Force is paying the rent. But what does the Air Force have the choice of when they rent your home? Who they put in there? Well, guess who the first family they put in our house? African Americans. And my dad was, I'll never forget this, he was just livid. He was just mad. Well, that's the way it was in those days. And, at the time, when you're just a young kid, you don't understand that. But I understand now what he was thinking and why it was so wrong. But he was just livid that they were going to put black people, and guess who else was livid? The neighbors. Yeah, they didn't want black people in that neighborhood. So this really kind of hits home to me. I understand what he's saying. So these marches organized by Dr. King are going to be through all white neighborhoods to protest discriminatory practices of real estate agents in the area. Now obviously, are these going to turn out to be possibly violent or dangerous? Well, certainly. The marches were very dangerous. Hundreds of angry whites threw bricks and bottles into the marchers. They did not want these black people in their neighborhoods protesting unfair anything. So the bottom line was, angry whites were throwing bricks and bottles into the marchers, and King himself was hit in the head with a brick during the march. So it was very violent. And they probably should have figured that out before they went, but that wasn't what they worried about. You know, they were making a point. So as they marched through these all-white neighborhoods in Chicago to protest discrimination among real estate agents who would not sell or rent to black people, hundreds of angry whites threw bricks and bottles into the marchers, and King himself was hit. Now, he was interviewed after this incident. And I want you don't write it down, I just want you to listen to his quote and see what you think he's meaning here. He says, "I think it is one of the most tragic pictures of man's inhumanity to man that I've ever seen, and I've been to Mississippi and Alabama. But I can assure you that the hatred and the hostility are really deeper than what I have seen in Alabama and Mississippi." So he believes that the violence that he saw in Chicago in the north is worse than any he had ever seen. Worst inhumanity to man he's ever seen. And he says, and I've been to Mississippi and Alabama. So he saw the worst up north, which was kind of surprising. Well, this is what I want you to remember about this. This event in Chicago, this was the first time that Martin Luther King really realized that the civil rights movement may result in his death. He finally realized that he may not survive the civil rights movement with the type of violence that was going on in the country. He thought he certainly could be killed supporting the movement. And it was in Chicago, after this incident, when he saw what he saw and was hit in the head with that brick, that he thought for the first time, holy smokes, I might lose my life in this movement. Okay? Even though he took the advice of his aides not to march for his safety, he wasn't thinking about being killed for his safety, but it was at this point in Chicago that he thought, boy, I might have an issue with my life. Well, after this awful violence occurred, because of the bad PR, Dr. King and the city of Chicago actually sat down and tried to negotiate better terms in what? Education, employment, housing. Okay? So Dr. King sat down with the city leadership of Chicago, and they tried to reach an agreement, and they did reach an agreement. Okay, they did reach an agreement. Okay, this awful violence in Chicago resulted in negotiations between Martin Luther King Jr. and the city leadership of Chicago, and they do meet an agreement. What do you think Martin Luther King gives up in this negotiation? Stop marching. So Dr. Martin Luther King agrees to stop marching in Chicago. In return, the city leadership promised to improve the housing, the education, and the employment opportunities in Chicago. And they did to a point. I got to give them credit. Not totally, but to a point. So this agreement between Dr. King and the city leadership of Chicago resulted in the marching in Chicago stopping on the part of the civil rights movement, and city leadership promised improvements in housing, education, and employment opportunities in Chicago. Well, what do you think the younger generation of Negroes thought about this whole thing? Did they see any change coming? Did they see maybe Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence working very well? And what happened is a lot of young Negroes were on the balance beam, so to speak, of whether they were going to stay with King or look at a more violent philosophy of protecting their rights. And what happened right in the middle of that decision-making process is Malcolm X, we talked about Malcolm X, black radical leader, was assassinated, was killed. And when he was killed, many young Negroes made him a what? Martyr for the movement. And so after Malcolm X's assassination, young Negroes interpreted the slain leader's death as a sacrifice for the Black Revolution, and he became a martyr for what movement? Black Power movement. So we're going to see here, we're going to talk about a couple other things, but we're going to see a change in a nonviolent approach to civil rights on the part of Negroes to a violent approach. But before we do that, we're going to talk about another major riot, which is our fifth example of violence during the LBJ administration. That was riots in Detroit, Michigan. Riots in Detroit, Michigan. talked about the Watts riot, right? Give you some information on that. Well, in July of 1967, another major riot occurred in the United States, this time in the city of Detroit, Michigan. So again, in July of 1967, we have another major riot in the United States, this time in the city of Detroit, Michigan. And again, local police and National Guard were sent in to restore order. Local police and National Guard were sent in to restore order. Another interesting aspect of this is the government sent in federal paratroopers. Most who had just returned from Vietnam were sent to Detroit as well to restore order. Federal paratroopers, most who had just returned from Vietnam, were sent in to restore order. Now you're thinking to yourself, gee, what are paratroopers? Don't they jump out of airplanes? Yeah, they do, but what do they do when they get on the ground? What do paratroopers do when they get into a hot zone? They fight. Okay, they're very well-trained fighting machines. So they brought in a lot of federal paratroopers. Most who had just returned from Vietnam were sent in. Now, as soon as the paratroopers arrived, they were under fire. Civilians were shooting at them. And so they set up military operations at a local school. So they run everybody out of this school and they set up local military operations in a local school after being fired upon as they come into Detroit. So the paratroopers came under fire at the outskirts of Detroit, and as a result, they set up military operations in a nearby school. Now, if you can imagine, Worland High School, you know, we got a school here. They set up military installations. They got floodlights and machine gun posts in all four corners of the school. Floodlights and machine gun posts in all four corners of the school. So because of this threat, this school that they set up as a military operation had floodlights and machine gun nests set up in all four corners of the school building, if you can imagine that. Jeeps with M16 machine guns mounted on them patrolled the city. Can you imagine that? Jeeps, military jeeps with M16 machine guns mounted on the jeeps were patrolling sections of Detroit. Tanks were in the streets of Detroit. And these paratroopers, one of their first jobs was to restore order and gain back control of military tanks that these people overran. There were civilians in this riot in the military tanks, and the paratroopers had to reclaim from the rioters those tanks. I mean, seriously, it's crazy. So these paratroopers had to recover tanks from the rioters that were taken from the National Guard. So you can just picture how crazy this is getting. Well, here's the results of the Detroit riot. See how they compare. You might have to compare the two on your test, maybe. Okay? 43 people were killed in the riots in Detroit, nearly everyone black. 43 people were killed in the Detroit riots, nearly all black. "25% of the city was burned. 25% of the city was burned. $50 million worth of property was completely destroyed. $50 million worth of property completely destroyed. And they estimated the total losses at over $150 million. This is in 1967. Losses exceeded $150 million. The mayor of Detroit, you know, he made a comparison of what Detroit looked like after the riot. You know what he compared it to? War-torn Berlin in 1945 after World War II. That's what he compared the city of Detroit to. War-torn Berlin in 1945 after World War II in Europe. That's how he compared it. He thought they looked a lot alike. A city that had been ravished in a world war, he compared to what his city looked like after this riot. Guess who was more than happy to print pictures of U.S. Army tanks in the streets of Detroit? Who was more than happy to do that? What type of press, though? Not only ours, but who was really happy to show it? Soviets, very good. I mean, it was on the front page of the Soviet newspapers over in Russia. American tanks in the streets of Detroit. Okay? On how the Americans have absolutely lost control of their country. Who took tremendous pressure as a result of this riot in Detroit? LBJ. He looked at the people looked at the Watts riot and the riot in Detroit, and he took unbelievable heat for it. So what he did in late July of 1967, he took 3 significant actions on the issue of the riots. He did not want any more of these. So in late July 1967, President Johnson took 3 significant actions on the issue of rioting in the United States. 3 significant actions concerning the rioting that was going on in the United States. Number 1, he named a special commission to investigate these waves of riots that were sweeping across the United States. So he put together a commission or a committee to investigate these riots. Why are they happening? What can we do to prevent them? My God, what is the deal here? So he puts together a committee to investigate these riots that had already occurred. And there were more riots than just in Watts and Detroit. There were little riots in all kinds of cities across the U.S., but these were the bad ones, Watts and Detroit. So he put together, number 1, a special committee to investigate the wave of riots that were sweeping across the United States. What else might you do? What might you order Secretary of Defense McNamara to do? Because evidently we're not what when it comes to these riots, these National Guardsmen. Crazy if they're taking tanks from them. They're not very what? Well-trained. Well-trained, very good. So the second thing he did is he ordered Defense Secretary McNamara to issue new training standards for riot control to all National Guard units, so they could be properly trained in case there was a future riot. If you got citizens taking your tanks from you, you're not very prepared here. I mean, you don't understand how to fight rioting. So the second thing he did is he ordered Defense Secretary McNamara to issue new training standards for riot control, so that these National Guardsmen would know how to properly handle any future riots to this magnitude. And the third one's kind of interesting because it was pure political. What did he do? Anybody know? What would he do politically? Well, maybe a speech. What else might you do? You're on the right track, kind of. Who's mad at? Who's creating these riots? What type of people? Black people, because they don't think they're being shown any respect. You know what he does? He appoints Thurgood Marshall to the United States Supreme Court. First African American ever to serve on the nation's highest court. So to try to appease some of the black people who felt they weren't getting a fair shake, he appointed a black man, Thurgood Marshall, to the highest court in the land to try to show black people that they would be getting representation in the United States. So those are the 3 things he did. He created a special commission to investigate the wave of riots that were sweeping across the United States. He ordered Defense Secretary McNamara to issue training standards for riot control so these National Guardsmen would understand and be properly prepared. And he appointed Thurgood Marshall to the United States Supreme Court, the first black man to ever serve in that capacity. Any questions on the riots in Detroit? You will need to make a comparison between the two, just so you know. Okay, our 6th event that we're going to talk about, and our last event that was a negative event that happened during the Johnson administration, was Black Power. We're going to talk about Black Power, that movement. Black Power. Now, this Black Power movement's going to need a leader. And the first leader comes about in 1966. A young black radical by the name of Stokely Carmichael becomes the first leader of this new Black Power movement. Stokely Carmichael. So in 1966, a young black radical named Stokely Carmichael became the new radical civil rights leader. And when he was named the leader of the new radical black power movement, he stated this. You don't have to write it down, but just listen. He said, "We've been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we're going to start saying is black power." That was kind of the initiative statement on black power. We've been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we're going to start saying is black power. Now, when he was asked to give his opinion on the nonviolent philosophy of the present civil rights movement under Dr. King, he said, quote, "Now I have said time and time again, the only thing nonviolent about the civil rights movement has been Martin Luther King. Now we have never defined it as a way of life. I never have. I've always defined it as a tactic." So what's he saying? That the only one that's really saying that the civil rights movement needs to be nonviolent is Martin Luther King. He said, "I've never really defined that as a way of life. I see it as a tactic." What he's saying is, we can use another tactic and go the other way, because this isn't working. He sees it as a strategy. Well, what was Dr. King's feelings of the Black Power movement, do you think? He thought it was the most dangerous component and challenge to the civil rights movement. He saw it as absolutely negative. He saw it as a dangerous component. He sees it as a negative challenge to the civil rights movement. So they asked him his opinion on black power, and he states the following: "We are all seeking political and economic power, but the phrase black power gives the wrong connotation." He just did not feel that was at all good for the civil rights movement. It was dangerous, and it was too big of a challenge.